I'm Mate Kapović from the University of Zagreb in Croatia. So my topic is not all nationalisms or language nationalisms are built the same in the case of former Yugoslavia. So I'll speak about whole of the former Yugoslavia, and at the end, because we are in Montenegro, and but not only because we are in Montenegro, but because Montenegrin example is, I think, in many ways the most interesting one in all of former Yugoslavia. I'll talk a bit more about Montenegro and Montenegrin. Okay, to start with, we often speak of nationalism with some right as something, well, maybe in academic circles and in some political circles as something negative in a bad way. Well, we can see that in ex-Yugoslavia as well, but here it's not so simple, right? So when we are speaking about nationalism in general, or language nationalism, not as the title of my presentation says, not all nationalisms are actually the same. So here I have an example which is deliberately not from former Yugoslavia. So this is an example from Turkey. So as I say here, we have nationalism of the oppressed and nationalism of the oppressor. So here, an example of Turkey, you can see the nationalism of the oppressed, Kurdish nationalism, where Kurdish people are actually just fighting for their right to use their own language, their own culture, traditions, and so on, while Turkish nationalism in Turkey actually wants to ban Kurdish, or at least make it less accessible, less used, and so on. So these two nationalisms, although we can say that both of those are actually nationalisms or language nationalisms are not the same, right? So this one, the Kurds are just fighting for their right to use their own language, and the Turks want to forbid their language. Okay, so in the territory of former Yugoslavia, pre-1990, basically what we have in domestic use, we have Srpsko-Hrvatski, Hrvatsko-Srpski, and some other titles, so Serbo-Croatian, Croato-Serbian. In English-speaking world and in other languages, this Serbo-Croatian as a term was used, and it is still used by some linguists, and not only linguists. And this was the official language in this central, as you all know, in these central republics of former Yugoslavia, so in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia. Although the situation, so this was the official usage, like Srpsko-Hrvatski, Serbo-Croatian, and so on. Although the situation was a bit more complicated than you can get from, for instance, nationalists in Croatia today, they will say, no, you couldn't use Croatian as a term, there's only Serbo-Croatian and so on. So you can see here that these are two Croatian grammars. You had first one is named Croato-Serbian, and the second one is named only Croatian. So from 1972. So already in Yugoslavia, it was not so clear, right? So you had, for instance, grammars of Croatian only, right? So it was not as dogmatic or as rigid as some people want to claim it is today. So post-1990, after the breakup of Yugoslavia, what was formed, that when you want to use one term for this whole of literally or standard Shtukavian, what is now often used is this term BCMS, or some people will not use this M, so then it's just BCMS, so Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian, and you can see that there are separate grammars of all four these varieties. So the name of the language is very politicized, and it's still an issue not only in the region but also in outside of it. In my opinion, it is not so much a linguistic issue but a political issue, right? So before 1990, the usual stance was that it is just one polycentric language, as many still hold today. But after 1990, at least in former Yugoslavia, in post-Yugoslavian states, the usual political stance was that these are four very similar standard but separate standard languages, right? So what is often not taken into account here, that not only when you speak about separate language like Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, and Serbian, but also when you speak about BCMS in general, or this Serbo-Croatian in general, as it was called, that also this BCMS or Serbo-Croatian was also a nationalist construct, right? Because if you take a look at the dialectological borders from Bulgaria to Slovenia, there is actually, when we're speaking about dialects, there is no dialectal border on the border of Serbia in the southeast, on the border of Serbia and Bulgaria and Macedonia, or on the border of Croatia and Slovenia. So there is no real border. So Serbo-Croatian or BCMS is also is as nationalist as these separate BCMS, right? Except that here you have 4 nations which have the same language and not 4 different languages, but it's just as nationalist as these separate languages. Okay, so when we speak about this post-Yugoslav territory, we often present it as something very special, not only people from former Yugoslavia, but also people outside of it. Although in my opinion, it is not so special, because we actually have many similar examples of this kind of language situation in other parts of the world. So for instance, in my opinion, the relation between Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian is very, very similar, of course, with some historical and other differences. So when you speak about varieties of English, as in UK, US, and so on, varieties of Spanish in Spain, Latin America, varieties of French, like in France, Canada, and so on, these are all, of course, these are all stem from colonialism, right? And between varieties of German, which is not a product of colonialism, in Germany, Austria, Switzerland. So we can see here that here, especially in the case of colonial languages, we use the same name for all this. So English is in America, but English is also in Great Britain. There are other examples like this where usually different names are used. So you have Dutch in the Netherlands, but you have Flemish in Belgium, or you have Hindi in India, and you have Urdu in Pakistan, or you have Indonesian in Indonesia and Malaysian in Malaysia, and you have Farsi in Iran, Dari in Afghanistan, and Tajiki in Tajikistan. So these are all, linguistically speaking, cases which are very similar to the one in former Yugoslavia, and in some cases, like in this first part, one name is used, and in the second part, usually 2 names are used, though you can sometimes say, yeah, then you have like Hindustani for Hindi and Urdu and so on, but it is not as commonly used. Linguistically speaking, this is very, very similar, especially, for instance, Hindi and Urdu, like Croatian and Serbian, this is very similar. Okay, so the linguistic sort of objective reality is that the relation of these parts of BCMS standard varieties is very similar to these varieties of English, Hindi, Urdu, Farsi, Dari, Tajiki, etc. Of course, language names are connected to nations, to national identities, and of course, names of languages are connected to this politics in general or national identity. So, when it comes to identity, of course, or nationalism, we can have very different ideas. So you can have one nation, one language, 10 nations, 10 languages. 10 is just a random number here. You can have 10 nations, one language, and so on and so on, right? So all of these are political claims. So there are no, as we all know, there are no objective nations. So you cannot objectively say that somebody is this or that. This is all political, right? So these are political ideas from 19th century and on, right? So you can see, for instance, the examples of Arabic, where you have a number of states from Maghreb to Qatar, which all speak Arabic and have one modern standard Arabic, right? So, which is kind of a modernized classical Arabic. When you look at real languages spoken in these countries, these are actually different languages. So the Arabic from Morocco, Arabic from Egypt, Arabic from Kuwait, these are actually different languages, just as Slavic languages are different, right? But for cultural, historical, religious, and other reasons, Arabs choose to have one standard language and consider these something like spoken languages, spoken dialects, and so on. In Slavic language family, we have, of course, different languages, which are all political, right? And they're connected to nation states usually, right? But we can also imagine, you can imagine, for instance, Old Church Slavic was spoken in the 9th century, Classical Arabic in the 7th century. So Slavic is even younger, right? So we can imagine that in like alternate reality scenario, if history was different than it was, we can imagine that we have some Križanić style pan-Slavic standard language, right? So if we had, for instance, I don't know, because of whatever reason, you can imagine that all present day Slavic, we have different Slavic states, but we all speak some kind of modernized pan-Slavic language, and all of these present day languages are just, we consider them spoken languages, dialects, and so on. This, of course, is not the case, but it could have been the case, right? If the situation was like in Arabic states. So this just shows this, this thought experiment just shows that politics and language can mesh in different ways, right? So, okay, so types of language nationalism in the example of former Yugoslavia. So here, in my opinion, we can have, there are two basic types of language nationalism and nationalism in general in ex-Yugoslavia. So Serbian language nationalism is mostly expansive. So you can say that Serbian nationalists very often say everybody actually speaks Serbian, right? So you can say it's Croatian, Montenegro, but you actually speak Serbian, and actually, you know, all of you are Serbs, right? So this is, nationalists from other countries can say, you know, this is because, you know, Serbians are by nature aggressive and so on. Genetically, I don't know, imperialist and so on. Of course, this is not the case. This is not the case that Serbia was one of the first independent states. It's the biggest one. There are Orthodox-speaking Slavs, Serbs all over ex-Yugoslavia. The capital was in Serbia and so on. So there are some political, historical tendencies why Serbian nationalism is actually expansionist, right? Not expansive, expansionist. This is a typo. On the other hand, Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin language nationalism is mostly, not always, but mostly isolationist or separatist. What does that mean? That means that Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin nationalists or language nationalists will say Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin are separate languages different from Serbia. So usually they will not say, no, you Serbs are actually Bosnians, right? So they will not say that, but or you are actually Croatian or actually Montenegrin. They'll just say, no, we are different from you. So this is, you have expansionist nationalism mostly in Serbia, and this isolationist nationalism in other countries. So here, I don't know why it's not, so what this is supposed to be. So here, yeah, so unfortunately, you cannot see these pictures, but here I wanted to speak about the recent cases in Serbia where for the last 30 years in Serbia, the case was that like every couple of years you had some interview by a Serbian linguist, and he said in an interview like, oh, you know, you're actually all Serbs, you actually all speak Serbian, like for Croatia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and so on. Recently, for the last 4 years, there is this what I call interdepartmental Serbist conference. So basically, they gather up every year in Vuk Karadžić's birthplace, and they have this declaration where they basically say, well, it's not as open, but they basically say, what they say is, well, actually, you all speak Serbian, and you can see that what is meant is that you are all Serbs. So you have this much more, which is kind of strange because there's, you know, it's almost 30 years from the war in Bosnia and Croatia, and still nationalism and language nationalism in Serbia seems to be getting more institutionalized than it was before, and it seems to go from the top, right? So the politics from their present goes into this nationalist, expansionist tendency, and then you cannot see it here, but of course, for instance, in this last declaration from like a couple of months ago, they said, one of the things they said that Dubrovnik, which is a town in southern Croatia, said Dubrovnik is actually Serbian, right? And Dubrovnik literature is actually Serbian literature, part of Serbian literature, and so on. So you had a response. You cannot see it here, but the response from Croatia, there was a lot of responses, but one of the academics from Croatia actually said she had a straight up Nazi response. She said that Serbs are like bugs, right? So this is a very unfortunate example where you can see that nationalism on one side breeds nationalism on the other side, right? So as you can see, this is still going on. Okay, so here you can see on the left there was the Declaration of Common Language in 2017, which had signatures from all over former Yugoslavia, and I think in general most of the people who signed it and people who were the originators of it had, in my opinion, noble intentions, right? So they were like anti-nationalists, mostly liberal, some of them left-wing, politically speaking, and they had best of intentions, like, they saw nationalism as something harmful, and they wanted to, people to say, stop with this, don't segregate children in school, and so on. This declaration had some problems, right? It was very positivist, liberal, politically speaking, and so on, and which I will not get into today, but it also had some consequences where some of the people, so you can see this Rajka Glušića, which is a Montenegrin pro-Serbian linguist, who Adnan also mentioned. She, for instance, used this type of discourse, like we all speak a common language, to basically use it as a mask, as a cover for covered Serbian nationalism, right? So she said, no, you Montenegrins who want the Montenegrin language, you're actually nationalists, and we, where this common language is actually Serbian, right? So this is how this, in my opinion, this positivist, liberal, anti-nationalism, they use it as a mask for Serbian, for actually Serbian nationalism, Serbian anti-Montenegro nationalism. And you can see here on the right, this is Milorad Pupovac, who is a politician. He's a representative of Serbian minority in Croatia, who is actually, politically speaking, he's like center-left, right? So he's not a nationalist, he's not a right-winger, but he also used some of the arguments from this Glušića's book to also kind of attack Montenegrin language and Montenegro and so on. I don't think it was for some bad intention. I don't think he's actually a nationalist or a Serbian nationalist, but this is that you can see that the things are quite complicated because this sort of liberal anti-nationalist discourse can be used also for nationalism, right? Okay, so different language names do not really change the reality, right? So the relation of, for instance, Montenegrin, Macedonian, or Croatian, Montenegrin, between this BCMS, right, Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian, between each other, it will never be, well, never. It's not the same as, for instance, relation of Croatian, Slovenian, or Croatian, Hungarian, and so on, right, which are completely different languages, right? So it will always be something more close, right? Of course, language names are performative and thus not unimportant, but whatever you call it, whether you call it 4 different languages or one language with different varieties, it's still we can all speak these languages and we'll understand each other. However, every nation does have a right to call its, in my opinion, its language by its name. So this is the problem with this Serbo-Croatian as a term, because this is the language. Even if you have one term, this is not the language of only Serbs and Croatians, but also of Bosnians and Montenegrins. So they have the right to call their language by their own name as well, right? So what is deconstruction of nationalist myths and programs is necessary, especially in academic circles. But Western academics and also post-Yugoslav liberal anti-nationalist scholars should be careful not to engage in Orientalist, well, not literally Orientalist, but let's say Balkanist, colonialist smug shows about wild Balkan nationalists and post-Yugoslav exceptionalism as if nationalism in ex-Yugoslavia is something very different, from other nationalisms, especially when it's ill-informed. So, for instance, you will sometimes see, not so much in written text, but in informal circles, they will say, "Oh, look at those funny Montenegro nationalists with their made-up new letters, right? So they're so funny, their nationalisms, and it's 21st century and so on." So this is not really constructive. there are a lot of nuances here. So, as I said, not all language nationalisms are the same. So, for instance, claiming that from the perspective of Serbian nationalism, that everybody actually speaks Serbian, that's one thing. Or from the perspective of aggressive prescriptivist interventions in Croatia, where they will change some words like materinji, as people normally say, to materinski, just because they say, no, this is like proper Croatian, even nobody actually normally uses it that way. This is another thing, right? And it is completely different from C, which is what we have in Montenegro, where we have quite moderate and facultative standardization of, for instance, general phonological features actually used and actually existing in the way people in Montenegro speak. So if you have stuff like djeca for children, shekira for axe, and iđelica for somebody who likes to eat a lot, in Montenegro, these are things that people actually say it like that. So this is not the same as if you're making stuff up, like what happens very often in Croatian prescriptives and Croatian language nationalism, or if you just want to say that, no, everybody is Serbian, right? So you can say that all of these are actually nationalisms, but they are not of the same type, right? So you can promote unity, political or language unity, and this is a legitimate political opinion because you can have any kind of political opinion you want, right? And not everything will be very popular, but you cannot use it as a mask of particular expansivist nationalism. And I will finish with this. This is the last one. So this neo-Montenegrin standardization, as I call it, with these new letters, right? This, where you have this stuff like djed for grandpa, shever for north, and koji for goat as an adjective. This is often presented by its opponents as some kind of 19th century style nationalist fabrication. So, you know, only old grandpas in some Montenegrin villages speak like that, and these crazy Montenegrin nationalists want everybody to speak it because they're just crazy nationalists from the Balkans. So this is not the case. In reality, this neo-Montenegrin standardization, this new Montenegrin orthography, grammar and so on, this is actually very much in tune with modern linguistics and its appreciation of realistic spoken language and anti-prescriptivism, right? So this is different from what we have in Croatia and Serbia, where prescriptivist standardization is still very much in power. So for instance, in Croatian prescriptivists will generally dislike a realistic spoken language, while the proponents of Montenegrin will generally favor it because they want what they did with this neo-Montenegrin standardization, that they actually introduced how people actually speak, so they can now not only speak it, but they can also write it, right? So this is very different from this prescriptivism and the ideology of standard language, which we see, for instance, in Croatia, right? And as the last thing, both international and post-Yugoslav scholars should re-evaluate this problem, right? And base their conclusions on a realistic appraisal of basic linguistics facts, right? So what I mean to say by this is that actually everybody, regardless of whether they are politically Montenegrin or Serbian or whatever, actually everybody says djed in Montenegro. The only question is, and not djed, right, the grandpa. So the only question is whether, so this is how Montenegrin is actually, how language in Montenegro is actually used. So the only question is, and this is now standardized, not as obligatory, but you can write it like this as well, and you can speak like this in television, for instance. The only thing is whether Montenegrins want this to be also standardized forms, but this is the question, in my opinion, for Montenegrins. So nobody from Belgrade or Zagreb can tell people in Montenegro how they should speak or what their standard language should be like. This is for the people in Montenegro to decide by themselves. Thank you. Hvala.